Hello everybody, welcome to the second G4 Lab IB Biology video. Today we'll be covering the topics of the processes of life, an introduction to cells, and an introduction to viruses. For cells, we'll mostly be covering introductory topics like the shared processes of life, the shared structures of life, and why viruses are not considered alive. Let's start off with our first topic, which is the processes of life. So all life share these common processes of life, which includes both multicellular and unicellular organisms, which both of them need to carry out all of these processes to be considered alive and to stay alive as well. So the first one we'll talk about is metabolism. Metabolism is the sum of all the chemical reactions within a cell. And to speed up these chemical reactions, enzymes are proteins that are able to catalyze, which means speed up these metabolic reactions. Now we'll talk about more viruses later, but since viruses lack their own metabolism, that is the reason why they are not considered to be alive. Now there are two types of metabolism. There is an anabolic reaction and a catabolic reaction. The image I have up here right now is one example of an anabolic reaction, where energy and small molecules come together and react to form a larger molecule. Now, if we take, for example, a catabolic reaction, it would be the opposite way, meaning that a large molecule would react and break down into energy and small molecules. Those are two big types of metabolism. Next up, we have excretion, where it is the process of removing metabolic waste from an organism, because obviously metabolism, everything and every result out of metabolism won't be used, meaning they need to be excreted somehow out of life. For example, humans excrete CO2 when they're breathing, and plants can excrete oxygen when they're done with their photosynthesis. And next up we have nutrition. You're probably familiar with the word nutrition, but when it comes to IB biology and as nutrition as a process of life, nutrition is something that must be obtained by an organism such as energy and materials in order to survive. Now there are two different types of ways life obtains nutrition. For autotrophs are able to obtain this energy and material through abiotic sources, such as sunlight going into plants to create energy through photosynthesis. For heterotrophs, they use other biotic sources, which means alive sources, that can produce their own energy because the organism itself cannot. For example, a lion eating another animal, which that animal might gain energy from eating different plants or other biotic factors that are autotrophs. Next up we have movement. Obviously, you're probably also familiar with this one because hopefully you're moving every day. Now movement, there are two main different types of movement. We have motile movement and sessile movements. Now motile movements are obviously mobile. They physically move around like humans walking around, while sessile, they mostly just stay in one place like plants. Despite plants not really moving from one place to another, they are able to do this process called phototropism, where they directionally grow towards a stimuli like sunlight in order to grow better. So for example, in this picture we have the sun and how the plant grows towards the sun in order to get more sunlight, which in turn is able to produce more energy and materials for the organism. And next up we have the process of homeostasis. Now this one's a little trickier, but by definition, it is something that causes the organism to maintain a stable internal condition despite the changes in its external environments. So for example, we have how the human body can regulate temperatures. So for example, if you're in a cold environment, it will try to regulate itself to be a little warmer, in turn to make up for the colder outside environment. Another example is how insulin is able to control the blood glucose levels within your blood. Next up we have growth and or development. Not all life has to have both, but most tend to have growth and development. Now there is pretty key differences between the two, however. Growth is the physical change, such as the mass and the size of the organism throughout its life, how a human quite literally gets bigger from a baby to an adult person. However, development is a little bit more different. Development is the transformation of an organism throughout its life. Like, for example, the image we have up here is a caterpillar. A caterpillar starts off as a small bug, without any wings, without any flying capabilities, but throughout its course throughout the course of its life, it is able to transform and develop into a butterfly with features that it didn't have when it was a caterpillar. And next up, we have the response to stimuli. Now, all life must be able to recognize any changes in their environment and obviously respond accordingly. For single cells specifically, they are able to recognize the environment by the stimulation of one of their receptor proteins, which we'll cover in another video, within their cell membrane. So let's take for an example for response to stimuli. For example, if you're in a cold place, you would obviously respond to the cold by trying to find heat. So if you were to be near a campfire, obviously you would respond to the stimuli by going towards the warmer place in order to survive. And next up, we have reproduction. You probably have also heard about this, but there are two different types of reproduction. Now, reproduction in general is mainly an organism, a living organism, creating an offspring. So for example, we have two different reproduction types. We have asexual and sexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction is where one parent creates a genetically identical offspring. There's no other factors involved, and they're usually through processes like binary fission. When it comes to sexual reproduction, it is when two different parents breed together into creating a genetically unique offspring. Now, we'll cover more of this in the genetics video, but that is the basics of the process of life of reproduction. So let's use the single cell organism Chlamydomonas as an example. Sorry, the visual I have up on the screen here is not obviously what the actual organism looks like, but it is a visual representation for biologists to be able to easily separate the different structures within a cell. Now, in reality, all of these organelles and subcellular structures would be packed together, but nonetheless, this is to make it easier for you guys to see what process is happening in which part of the cell. So in a Chlamydomonas, there are several different parts. We have the flagella, contractile vacuole, cell membrane, eye spot, and cytoplasm, obviously noted here, but there are obviously other subcellular structures within here that we learned last time, like the nucleus, and they are obviously considered organelles, but they don't necessarily have to all contribute to the processes of life that we just learned. So let's start off with the process of homeostasis. Homeostasis within this organism usually happens through the use of the contractile vacuole. The contractile vacuole is able to hold the excess water within the cell, and it will swell up and expel into an opening within its membrane. Metabolism usually happens in the cytoplasm, or in this case it can also happen in the chloroplast, because they both contain dissolved enzymes that are able to catalyze, speed up metabolic reactions such as digestion or photosynthesis or even cellular respiration. Next, we have nutrition, which, since this is an autotroph organism, it is able to use the photosynthesis process for its own nutrition. When it comes to movements, it utilizes its flagella to move around in its space, meaning that this organism is motile. For excretion, the oxygen byproduct of its photosynthesis diffuses out of its cell membrane that we can see in this visual. Obviously, this organism also grows. This cell will continue to grow until it reaches more of a maximum size that it can hold, and more specifically, it is more of a maximum surface area to volume ratio, and then it'll eventually divide into another organism. It also obviously has response to stimuli. Now, this usually happens through the eye spot there, which allows the Chlamydomonas to be able to sense light and move towards it using its flagella, because obviously it will need light to survive and, go through photosynthesis. We already talked about reproduction earlier, but yes, it will divide through mitosis once it reaches an ample size. So this is one example of an organism that goes through all of these characteristics and processes of life, and yes, you could probably go through a list of organisms and every single one will be exhibiting all of these different processes of life, but obviously they won't be the exact same way as how the Chlamydomonas exhibits these processes. Moving on into a bigger topic that we'll cover in many different videos, but for our second topic of this video, we'll be introducing cells. Now, we learned about cells in the last video. They're one of the levels of organization of the hierarchy we talked about last time, and that is where life emerges. Now, when we talk about cells, we need to obviously cover the cell theory first. There are 3 key points within the cell theory. I have them up here right now, but they are, as said, all cells must come from pre-existing cells. Cells are the basic unit of life, and all living things are made of cells. Those are the 3 key points of the cell theory, and they are definitely very important to keep in mind. And when it comes to cells, there are 4 common structures that are always within a cell, which is the cytoplasm, the ribosome, DNA, and plasma membrane. Let's cover the cytoplasm first. You might already know what the cytoplasm is in your general biology class or any other class you might have heard this from, but cytoplasm is made up of dissolved substances, and they are something that kind of serves as a structure for the cell almost, which holds every organelle into place, and it's more of a place where metabolic processes can be occurring within the cell. And next up we have the ribosomes. The ribosomes are a very important part of the cell, and we'll definitely be covering them more in a different video. However, for the simplicity of this introduction into cells, ribosomes are a structure made up of 2 parts, and they are able to catalyze the creation of polypeptides within the cell. And they're usually just free-floating or attached to something known as the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Furthermore, we have DNA. I hope you already know about DNA, but DNA is the genetic material for all living things right now. And within eukaryotic cells, they are contained within the nucleus, as you can see within this image, where the nucleus is containing the DNA of this cell. Finally, we have the plasma membrane. We'll probably have an entire video just on the plasma membrane and its proteins later, but the plasma membrane is more of a barrier that separates the inside of the cell to its surrounding, and they are made up of things called phospholipids. Those are the 4 common structures found within every single cell, but yes, they're definitely important to remember, and we'll definitely be covering them more in a different video, or you could go ahead and go search more information about them up, but these are just very general descriptions, just so you know what the 4 different common structures within a cell are. And if you wanted more information, obviously, let's say for example chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are not in every single cell, but a plasma membrane is definitely required in every single cell. And finally, for our topic 3, it'll be very short, but this will be our final topic for today, but this will be the introduction to viruses. I only have 1 slide here for you today, but essentially, viruses are not alive. That should be your key takeaway from this topic. Now, there are many different reasons why they're not considered alive. Obviously, earlier in the video, we covered the different processes of life, and if you don't have them, you're not really considered alive by biological definition. There are 4 main key points I want you to leave here with today on viruses, and why they are not considered alive. Now first, they do not grow on their own. Second, they are not able to perform metabolism on their own, as I said earlier, and they are not able to replicate themselves, and the fact that they are not made of cells. Remember in the cell theory, cells are the basic unit of life, and all living things are made of cells. Considering that viruses are not made of cells, they are hence not considered alive. That's it for viruses for today, but we'll definitely have more on that on a later video. But viruses are obviously an important topic to IB biology, but the main thing I want you to take away from today's video is the cell theory and the introduction to cells. For those interested, I believe the next video will be more about microscopy. There are 2 different main types of microscopes, which is the light and electron microscopes, and there are different ways to be using both of these microscopes and different calculations that you'd want to be doing under the microscope. We'll be covering that in the next video, and it'll be a little more math intensive than the memorization we've been doing so far, but yes, please enjoy our next video or check out our computer science and physics videos if you are interested. Thank you.